So thank you all for joining us. This is the first webinar of our fall series. I'm very happy. I had a chance to meet with Jill a couple of weeks ago to hear about what she and her company are doing. It's a fascinating conversation, and Jill is a really engaging speaker, so I'm really looking forward to this. So Jill Miller is the CEO of Lunum, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you. So Jill, thank you again.
And thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for making the time today, especially after hours. So I'm going to introduce Lunum to you in a little bit about our philosophy and what we're up to in the world. I'll get into my background a little bit, but Lunum was born to solve a problem, and it was how do we use the size, scale, and influence of large companies to reduce inequities across value chains. And for us, the answer is simple. It's how do we leverage the high quality data to empower businesses to really drive, measure, and validate impact across their supply chain. So my background, I've been around for a while. My background is actually prior to being in data and sort of on the impact side of the world. I spent 20 plus years in enterprise business development, generally spending time on factory floors, bringing innovations to packaging, process, and automotive industries. And these were primarily plant floor technologies. But a few years ago, I got to a point where I felt like I was a kind of a cog in the machine, if you will, and started Lunum because I thought there must be a better way to evaluate how companies are performing relative to their workforce impact. So I shifted my focus to work on more sustainable prosperity in the workforce across supply chains, and also to look at how we measure that alongside a business result. So over the last few years, I've had the privilege of doing a lot of work with Brookings Institute. We focus on UN Sustainable Development Goals 8 and 10 for decent work and reduced inequalities. And I've been able to be a member of the 17 Rooms Initiative. If you don't know it, check it out. It's wonderful. And there's a lot of open calls for people with great ideas to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm very proud to say that we are now, the NSF has recognized what we're doing as a potential way to look at impact differently across supply chains than they have been, and just across ecosystems in terms of workforce impact. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about impact accounting across a supply chain, and we look at workforce as a value premium, almost like a portfolio. And in that, how does doing good create value and impact? Billion-dollar question, right? We hear this a lot with what's going on in the world, so we'll touch on that. And then we also are seeing a shift in how the world views human capital. And for the students out there and any professionals, I imagine, the decisions a supply chain manager or supply chain management team makes a difference to real people. And what we've identified, right, is that the current system, I think we all know, doesn't always work in terms of how we value workforce people. And we want to be able to provide these metrics that allow people to create impact instead of sort of a do-good or a performative approach. So the other piece is that not only is the world changing the way it views it, but so are the regulatory agencies, et cetera. We'll get into that. And then I'm a big fan of the Jesuits. I grew up in a family of Jesuits across my extended family. So I'm a big fan of St. Ignatius and the mission of the Jesuits. And I really believe that like authenticity is how we get to change the world. So I'm usually pretty direct. So hopefully that this all goes well. I'm excited to talk to you guys today. So we'll get through this and then we'll get into some questions. So systemic level change, particularly in the United States, is what we're focused on right now. This is a very large problem. And for sure, it's not something that's solved easily. It's complex. But I wanted to begin with an example and a little primer on the difference between what would be seen as performative that a company might talk about in terms of their impact and what actual impact is. So, right, this was a LinkedIn post that I commented on a few weeks ago, and the author said, what CPG brands do you know are giving back to their communities and helping the planet? I'm very curious to know and want to be inspired by do-good intentions. And my head starts to explode when I see these things, and I think like, well, do good is great, but we're not measuring it, and it's not time bound, and we're not able to compare it against something else. And I know Mike's laughing at me because he's similar in his line of thinking. But while doing good is very important, what is generally reported externally in a lot of sustainability reports or updates is generally performative, and it doesn't carry a lot of transparency and information about what the organization has achieved or where their problems that exist. So in my mind, there's the big question is whether a company and every organization, every human being, we get up every day and we create positive and negative impacts, right? This is a natural law. So the big question to me is whether our positive impacts environmentally or socially are outweighing the negative impacts that we're creating. And I think we all probably on this call have had many primers on what we need to do around the environmental and social things in the world to get back to balance. So I'll just give two examples of where impact might be seen as measurable or as positive outweighing negative. So I'm going to use General Mills as an example. So General Mills is a company, they deliver more fiber to Americans than any other company. And this actually, by calculations and impact accounting, shows that their net impact is positive on America, despite any other environmental or packaging waste that they may create. Second example would be Procter & Gamble pays wages that creates a larger positive impact than several of their competitors, which allows their entire workforce a bigger opportunity at thriving and generational wealth building than peers out there. So the way we see it is we're focused on the S in ESG, and I know that's kind of a loaded weaponized term, but so far we don't have a replacement yet. So the S in ESG we see is just about 10 years behind where environmental was. And if you remember 10 years ago, a lot of companies talked about, we're reducing waste or we're shifting to recycled paper, but there was no measurable goal around that. And now what we see in environmental is people are measuring impact. There are standards out there. People report on recyclability rates, and ultimately we all know net zero. So in terms of the social, we feel like we're pretty far behind, and where we're at today, we've seen the environment evolve drastically, and companies are expected, not only do they do it just out of being good, but they're expected to commit to these emission reduction targets against the UN and in regulatory areas. But the S is currently undergoing this evolution really as we speak, and it's happening rapidly. I'm hoping that we're able to learn from the process environment went through and move toward something that is, hold on, I'm struggling here. I'm not as good in the animations as I should be. Move away from this idea of self-reporting, isolated success stories around diversity and workforce and human capital, and move toward third-party data that's more accurate, addressing disparities directly and talking about those in the marketplace. I'll show a case study on a company that announced they had a wage equity issue, how they addressed it, and then we did some third-party analysis to see that change happen. And then the other piece, right? One of my favorite economists is Rebecca Henderson from Harvard, and she talks about, right, finance can save the world, but we need to learn to love the long term. So long-term commitments, and then taking and monetizing those commitments, what they mean in our organizations and to our broader world. So I start out with, what does the future look like, right? And to me, the future I want to see, and I'd ask everybody to indulge me and maybe think about the future you want. I don't have it with me, but right, like a girl walks into a coffee shop, and when she gets her coffee, at least I do, I want to walk into a coffee shop and I want the future to be that there's a mark somewhere on that cup that tells me that everyone in the supply chain who provided the coffee beans and maybe provided the cup and the lid, all of those people had a chance to flourish. I'm not saying they all had to self-actualize, but they at least had the opportunity. And right now that doesn't exist. So that's the future I'm looking for, is to know that everyone had a chance. aside from that, I'm also looking for the same things most business leaders are looking for, which is increased brand value, increased valuation, increased revenue, reduced risk, and reduced turnover. So that's what we're aiming to bring people. One of the biggest challenges, though, I think as leaders is that people want to have excellent outcomes and high impact from whether it's workforce initiatives, diversity initiatives, inclusion, and they want to create a positive impact on the communities and the workers where they do business. But there are some frustrations we see, and I'd love to hear feedback at the end about, where people are constrained because of shareholder or stakeholder competing interests. So I want to step back and just kind of define the problem as we see it, and some of the external elements for organizations that are holding them back, and then some of the internal elements that are holding people back. So in terms of, we talk about stakeholder pressure a lot. We all know what's happened the last 3 years, right? Our future of work has changed significantly. We did some external studies, particularly on consumers, but also when it comes to employees and talent. People want to work for companies that are diverse and inclusive and value their workers. We've seen numbers, 15% of employees leave organizations because they lack diversity, and 64% of candidates in one study are less interested in a company that shows a lack of diversity or interest in their workforce. And then we did a study with a third-party independent consumer insights company, and we know that consumers are voting with their wallets and their smartphones. And when we looked at this, we found that over 80% of consumer packaged goods customers and consumers particularly were interested in buying brands or shopping with companies that were certified as socially responsible and looking at workforce impact. They're also they're driving, the stakeholder pressure is driving toward people making public commitments around being better or doing better. And I know we're all familiar with purpose and profit, which is where we're headed as well. One thing I want to pause on here, if you've not been following, some of what we're talking about related to bringing impact accounting to life is that regulatory efforts are changing, and some of the standards related to accounting around workforce and human capital are changing. So we feel like it's important to inform and let people know what's coming in terms of changing regulations and increasing standards. So the first I'll talk about just a little bit is FASB. If you're not familiar, FASB is the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and FASB informs GAAP accounting standards, which is what most public companies, it's the bedrock of the U.S. financial reporting system. They have voted as of December unanimously to modernize GAAP accounting standards to disaggregate human capital, which means we're going to see a shift in having to report more detail around human capital and labor expenses, which is something a lot of companies have not done to date. So FASB and GAAP are connected. And then, of course, we've seen the climate shift and the rulemaking in the Securities and Exchange Commission for regulatory. This is also under discussion, and there have been several plenary sessions for the SEC related to human capital. We don't have an exact idea of where that's going, but we're following closely. We anticipate it's going to come. And some of it, if you aren't familiar with the CSRD, so CSRD is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, and they did pass into law earlier this year that will require mandatory reporting of non-financial metrics by firms, U.S. firms doing business in Europe. So there are several phases to this, but it's coming over the next couple of years. And what we're working toward is developing the things that you can use to get ahead of these and be prepared when they get here. We think we're going to see this a lot across supply chains in particular. So I always love my photo as well of Uncle Larry. If you're not familiar with Larry Fink, he's the CEO of BlackRock, and they control about 12% of the global investable market. While even recently, with a lot of the political rhetoric going on, he's talked about ESG is not necessarily a term that we're going to continue to use in the marketplace, but it is important, and that they're not going to be shifting the way they look at things. And many of the large institutional investors are looking this way. And my goal is hopefully, as institutional investors move toward the triple helix of risk, return, and impact when evaluating an investment in an organization, that we're providing corporations, public companies and their supply chains the same information that a BlackRock or a State Street might be looking at when they're making a decision, so that there's alignment of understanding of what impact means. And then from an internal perspective, we've spent a lot of time with companies. Just to give you a little context, when I paused my previous approach in my career to this direction, I spent about 6 months talking to a number of business leaders, just kind of asking, we see all this going on in the world. This was 2020, 21. So I know all the supply chain people want to wave a magic wand and forget it. But when I was asking questions around public commitments related to social justice, racial justice, workforce, worker impact, the overarching themes that emerged out of about 100 coffees and free lunches I cashed in were that people really had a plan to have a plan once they'd committed money. And what we started to see was there is no standard as to how we report publicly on workforce impact. A lot of organizations don't have someone internally to understand and tackle the problem, particularly across complex organizations or supply chain. There's a lot of, we had one of our ESG customers said, we've got everyone's in spreadsheets and it's a mess and it's not standardized. And we all report a little bit differently. And we see this continue into like equal employment opportunity reporting as well. There's inconsistencies in some organizations as well. And then at the end of the day, it was like, we can't speak publicly to what's going on in our own organization sometimes or across the supply chain. And then we had a number of leaders who were very passionate at a C-level across organizations that were like, we want to get away from this performative. We would love to speak to the numbers. So that is how Lunum was born. I was trying to listen to what the people wanted and make a change in the world. And so all of this, I hate to frame it all as a problem, because what I always believe is something I learned 25 years ago in my career is that in every problem, there is a hidden opportunity in a three-piece business suit. So I'll credit that to my first sales manager. But I think that the theme here is we all once believed that, and many of us did, and it has shifted, that right, business was one thing, and then you had your community. We've seen things trail in as more organizations are getting corporate social responsibility, and then we want to elevate to the next level. And when it comes to the S, or the people, we know that our businesses are people. And for as much as we say that they are our most valuable asset, at the end of the day, they are categorized as an expense on the balance sheet. And that creates a paradox to forward movement. So the good news in all this, though, even though there's a problem out there and there is some pushback in the marketplace around whether or not there is a return on when we invest in our people. What you see here is a screenshot in time from the Russell 1000 against the Just Capital leaders. And Just Capital is they were formed a few years ago, and they look at companies who lead in the space of the S and ESG around workers, and they look at 5 dimensions. I'd encourage you to check them out if you're not familiar. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what they have seen is the companies that perform the highest in terms of the S and ESG also outperform the Russell 1000 index. And over the last 20 months, that outperformance has been about 12.8%. So evidence is mounting now that organizations who invest in their people are definitely experiencing better returns in the market. So let's hope that just gets better and better. So our focus at Lunum is to help companies solve these problems and provide the data, let it speak for itself, but tie the human capital investment to an ROI, and to get people to change the way they think about a connection between business and employment, and ultimately a community impact to drive change throughout our communities. So what we'll see, I'm going to keep moving fast because I know we've got a lot to cover here. What we see overarching is people look a lot at inputs and outputs currently. We put a resource in, we get an output, and there's a result from that activity, whatever that is from the business perspective. Maybe it's wages or cost of labor. But what we're really trying to look for, and what impact weighted accounting is trying to look for, is what is the outcome? In this case, it might be you put wages in, what is the level of well-being of the people who were impacted by those wages? How does that actually impact society? And then how do we put a value on it so that you can start to look at it against your material balance sheets? So we're looking for more depth and then valuation as well. So we look at this in 3 steps. We want to be able to ask the right questions or ask some of the same questions a little differently. We want to be able to assign a value across an organization or an industry sector and a benchmark to show people where they stand and how they can get to better. And then my favorite, I think anyone in an organization that's centered on improvement is what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets improved. So we're trying to wrap a continuous improvement program around this so that people work toward better at the end of the day. So for us, if you've taken Psych 101, you probably know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it's a 5-tier model of human needs. So the very basic of it is, without meeting the first 4, you can't thrive, flourish, hit self-actualization. I'm not promising that we're going to create that for anyone. That's up to individuals. But I know that a lot of organizations and leaders care about their people. So what we're looking at is, how do we take and map those labor and employment metrics to meeting someone's needs, which we hope will result in a business result as well, and not just a result for their community. And when we talk about, there's a psychologist I've worked with who talks about, we can't even expect people to improve or address some of their issues until they've met their physiological needs. And in many cases, we do see in the US where employees aren't able to meet those physiological needs because of the wages they're earning. Right? We've all been through the last few years where we're really bringing inclusion to the forefront. And how do we measure the value of that? In terms of self-esteem, how do we measure people's ability to have an equitable opportunity to advance? So we take those, and then we convert those, or converted into labor and employment metrics. And I'll provide you, if you wish, with some good reading material. But then what we do is we run a set of calculations on our platform, and then it outputs a statement. So it lets companies know what their total impact is versus the wages they pay. So how impactful are the wages they pay, whether or not they're increasing or decreasing in a trend over time, and then where there's room for improvement. So this just looks basically like a traditional balance sheet, and then you can set it next to your other balance sheet. But you can begin to look at how an investment in one demographic or in one individual creates a return. So in terms of the math, I'm not going to go in. It's not that complicated, but I don't want to drag anyone down the impact weighted accounting rabbit hole. So this model that we're basing it on was built by Harvard, by George Serafim and a few others in the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative over the last several years. It's been peer reviewed, and we've used it. They've developed it primarily for regulatory adoption, investor adoption for impact investing. We've taken that same framework, and we're using it out in the marketplace for adoption by big corporates. And the idea here is that it's specific, it's robust, it's neutral, and it incorporates important measures. In 2021, the G7 Impact Task Force recognized impact monetization as the path forward of how we're going to solve our sustainable development problems, and that putting a dollar value in monetizing impact was going to be the way that we could do that. So since then, Harvard has spun out to what is now called the International Foundation for Valuing Impact, and they've been great partners of ours. They are led by a group of former Harvard folks, and then supported by a pretty robust technical team from around the globe, in how we continue to develop the methodology. So I'd invite you to check them out as well. They're going to be doing a methodology seminar here in a couple of weeks. I can post it on LinkedIn for anybody who's interested. But then we get to the manage and improve piece. And this is really where we're trying to create a low lift way for people to benchmark themselves, commit to a better, take action and improve, and then continually measure by a third party. So it might look like this in a supply chain. I call this the Candyland board, but essentially large companies engage with us to look at the impact of their supply chain, and how can they work with suppliers to create a journey of better. So we deliver a high level result to a company, and then their suppliers would receive granular data down to the location of it. Might be, you appear to have a wage equity issue in these plants, but not necessarily in these plants. So how can you guys cooperate to get better, or where can you identify areas for improvement? And then companies commit to better, and then we measure them annually. I already did that one. So let me show you just a quick case study, and then we'll land it for some questions. So in this, what I did was I took a look using our data, right? So we're curating data on employees and workforce, diversity, wage quality, opportunity, and then where are jobs being created and are they good jobs? In this case, I took a look at this is the materials sector of the Russell 1000. And so it includes a number of materials organizations, biotech companies, and this is the subsector of the global industrial classification standards that would be materials. So I picked two suppliers who are intentionally very different from each other, just for illustrative purposes. But supplier one is kind of what I see as what a lot of us are going for in the future, is that they are a company that enables biotechnology. In their mission statement, they look at diverse markets with a responsibility in their charter to ensure the product is used for positive purposes and the interests of stakeholders are considered when they make decisions or advance the mission. So we're starting to see a shift in language this direction. This company in particular has been around, I think it's since 2012, and since inception, they have stated they want diversity in thought in a variety of different areas, and inclusion to be part of their DNA. In 2020, they set some additional measurable and public goals related to wage equity. They identified they had a large wage equity issue. And then in 2022, they publicly reported their progress and that they had closed that gap. And it was about a 10.7% gap on gender in their organization. So that was something they publicly reported. It was self-reported. And then supplier two is a material science company that is stated they offer knowledge and manufacturing capabilities to support their customers' businesses in sustainability goals in a circular economy. So prior to 2022, the S part of their ESG or sustainability report was primarily focused on environmental. And then the S was generally some performative style reports. It would talk about some of their initiatives, but very little in terms of measurable goals. And in 22, they did come out and they set measurable and public goals. So I'll show you just kind of the difference. So the way we do our calculations, we'd be taking average salary at an organization, and then we'd be adding or subtracting based on how diverse you are at a location level to the local population. So do the people inside of a plant or a location look like the people in that community? Not do they look like the US community? So we're trying to get granular there. And then we look at the other areas related to wage. Are people making a living wage? Are there wage equity issues? And then look at opportunity as people move through the community, move through the organization. So in this case, when we put in the numbers, we get out evaluation. And what we see is this waterfall you see is the difference between the entire materials category across the Russell 1000. So it's a significant number of companies, and it varies in impact from about $76,000 per employee. So this is just an average per employee or an intensity down into the low $20,000 per employee. So what we see here, we go much more granular into slicing and dicing, but I'm just going to keep it high level. So the highest performers, they outperform the lowest quintile by almost 3 times. So there's a great deal of impact, which is going into these communities when organizations are able to pay higher wages, as we know, but when they're also more balanced in their approach to workforce impact. And then what we see is about a $62,000 average wage in the sector, but we're seeing an average, basically an average debit per employee of about $22,000. So the bottom line here is, by our methodology and the IWA methodology, impact can be improved on average by about 55% per employee. So not saying we know exactly what perfect looks like and what net zero looks like, but we do know what better looks like. So this is, again, that high performer, low performer as the supplier. When we look over time, we have the opportunity to look back about 5 years right now, and we expect that to become more, right, as time goes on, it'll become more longitudinal, but the impact change over time. So both organizations over time are trending upward. So they're actually trending upward in their impact, and it may be a number of factors because they aren't all mutually exclusive, but they're both trending upward. The supplier one, while they look like they've had a much larger trend just in the last year, they both had a change of about 8 to 10% over time, which is, right, fantastic. We all want to see improvement, and incremental every year over year is great. So when we drill down then into these are the 7 areas we look at. You can see on the left, I'm just going to focus on wage equity here. But for those two companies, again, so we see a deduction of about, by our calculations, of about $8,000 per employee. So that would be a deduction off of the total wages paid for each employee, because there isn't pure equity. But their number is about negative. It's about an $8,000 debit versus supplier 2, who is about a $13,000 debit. So much more room for improvement there. So when I look at that in terms of over time, so both of these companies, if you remember, they both made public announcements at various times. So the lower performer they've been seeing. So if you look to the top, the 0 line, we want to get to the 0 line up here on this graph. But the lower performer, they've actually been experiencing more wage equity issues over the last 5 years, as opposed to addressing them. And the signal that they did set measurable goals related to those looks like they're going to work actively to come out of those. And I'll just say again, we're seeing this from the data that we're curating. So none of these companies are providing the data. We're actually going out and gathering this data and using an algorithm and some multiple data sources to look at what a picture is of a company. So in 22, I expect that if they're head on addressing wage equity, we should see an uptick by the end of 23. And then this company in particular, the higher performer. So if you remember in 2020, they announced they had a wage equity issue. And then the data we see as we go through 2020 and 21, they have corrected the wage equity issue. And then it wouldn't be uncommon to see a taper off for a time period. And that may be short term. I always say if it's a straight line, it's no fun. But but you can see here where they're making measurable goals, and now there's third-party validation that that's occurring, and that's what we hope to provide to organizations and their supply chains. Next thing is, people always say, well, what does good look like? This is a relatively new framework. It's gaining a lot of interest globally, particularly in the financial markets. And I don't think at Lunum we claim to have all the answers today. But we do know what better looks like. And I think we can all agree that incremental improvement is something we're all chasing to create the better world we're looking for. We hope that providing transparency and some of the analysis can equip firms with a wealth of knowledge and allow them to make informed decisions. So we're going for change in decision making and road to improvement to get to a better tomorrow. So in terms of us and also impact weighted accounts, so what's a little different? I know we've talked to CFOs over the years, and they've said, yeah, impact accounting is great, but nobody really has implemented it. So we're trying to really drive implementation of something that is standard and uses best-in-class metrics to help people, companies, and I often say from the C-suite down to the street, have the same picture of what impact means and what the value of the impacts are. We also look toward, third-party data transparency. There is a lot of inaccuracy in self-reporting, particularly when you're gathering it from multiple organizations or multiple sites. And then we're working toward providing people with the capacity to translate this data into something that's quantifiable and ultimately tracked alongside the material balance sheet. And then again, continuous improvement. I've spent most of my life on a plant floor, and I know over the last 40 years in the United States, we've increased our productivity by 61%, and it's primarily been driven through continuous improvement. But what we hope ultimately this provides the stakeholders on the other side who have to work through the investor relations conversations or the HR conversations, that you start to be able to have a picture that people see as a credible picture, more accurate data, that not only are you making a commitment, but you're taking action and you're working toward better. So I will land it on, I'm going to go back to the future and just say that I think one of the things that I've realized over the last few years is, and I think it's only going to get bigger as we see impact investing grow, is that impact is a chain reaction, and negative impacts generally are, I like to frame them as missed opportunities to impact stakeholders positively. And I just always ask people to consider the role that they want to have in creating positive impact, whether that's in your own walls, in your community, or across the broader value chain. I think there's a very positive chain that can occur when we collectively work together, where people have the opportunity to flourish in different sectors. And I know there are a lot of really cool variety of people on this call, but people get to have the opportunity to be that like beacon is what I'm hoping. And again, I'll say in my Jesuit life, and I certainly would welcome any questions and would challenge anyone to like think about how, as you go home or hang up, how you want to engage and take action. So I hope you guys can recognize this as a valuable tool, and we're certainly interested in hearing feedback. We're kind of like feedback freaks here at Lunum. So yeah, I'll turn it over to questions. I know that was a lot. So
no, well, first let me just say thank you very much, Jill. I really appreciate the presentation. I've heard you talk about this before, so I already have some questions, but I'll ask one which I didn't ask before, which occurred to me as you were talking. If you think 10 years down the line and impact accounting and Lunum has been a huge success, what would that look like?
Oh, for me, I think we would at least half the number of organization or half the number of employees. So they're about, I think it's estimated about 40% of the 16 million hourly workers are under a living wage, according to MIT standards. I would like to say that like at least half of that goes away. I would like to see private sector take the lead on what drives policy. And I would love to see like 1 million people out of poverty. Ideally, we close the racial wealth gap measurably. But despite asking the Fed, I can't seem to get an actual number where it's at today. So as soon as I track that down, we'll make a commitment there. But I would love to see, right? Like my goal is, how do we impact like millions of people positively with this, and see this as an opportunity to change the way we think about things or behave maybe in our decision making. Good question.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the answer. I was also kind of anticipating that you would want to see something like Bloomberg report your impact number along with the
that
company.
Would be awesome too, right? If Bloomberg did, or if Larry Fink was like, Lunum is the way, that would be great, because it would afford us the opportunity to move on to our next goal. But yeah, I want to see the change more than anything. So
sure.
I guess Bloomberg is there. Yeah. So if you know anybody, let me know.
All right. Well, I certainly know we have many students here and then also non-students. Does anyone have a question?